Good evening, and welcome to the inaugural Geneva Forum at Upper House, a lecture series made possible by the partnership of Geneva Campus Church and Upper House, both located here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm Dan Hummel, Upper House's Director of University Engagement, and I wanted to take a brief minute here at the beginning to extend my thanks to Geneva Campus Church and Reverend Jim Kirk for working together to close for a year to resurrect this great tradition of Christian thinking in Madison. So thanks, Jim. For those of you unfamiliar with Upper House, we're a center for Christian study and gathering on the campus of the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Our mission is to explore the life of the mind and the questions of the soul from a Christian perspective for the betterment of ourselves, our campus community, and the world. And so the Geneva Forum is exactly the type of work that we thrive on. I want to acknowledge that most of you are tuning in virtually, while there is also a small in-person audience here at Upper House. And as we slowly emerge from the last year of virtual-only programs, we look forward to increasingly hosting many of our events in this hybrid format, with both live audiences and live streaming. So we welcome you on this journey of figuring out a new and better way to deliver our programs. And finally, we do anticipate some Q&A time after the lecture. Many of you took advantage of the registration form to pre-submit questions, and there are already many excellent questions. But I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll draw on submitted questions as well during the Q&A time. So, with those preliminary remarks out of the way, I want to invite up Reverend Jim Kirk, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I want to say thank you to the whole team at Upper House, and especially to Dan for all that you've done in preparation for our event tonight. This event is really the culmination of our shared passions for integrating faith, intellectual inquiry, and community engagement. And we hope that it's the first of many years to come. Our vision for the Geneva Forum at Upper House is that it would be an annual lecture in service to the church, the university, and the whole city of Madison, in which we learn together what it means to love God and to love our neighbor in the spirit of Christ. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Vincent Bacote, professor of theology and the director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College. It's an honor to have Vincent join us to speak on such an important and relevant topic for our world today: faithful politics in a divided world. On October 6, 1774, the Church of England priest and evangelist John Wesley wrote down in his journal the advice that he had given parishioners on this day about voting in an upcoming election. He wrote, "I met those of our society who had votes in the ensuing election and advised them three things. One, to vote without fee or reward for the person they judged most worthy. Two, to speak no evil of the person they voted against. And three, to take care that their spirits were not sharpened against those that voted on the other side." In the world in which we live today, Wesley's advice could not seem more radical. Generosity toward political opponents, following one's conscience in voting, avoiding a sharpened spirit. In our hyper-partisan age, it is hard for many to imagine that the Christian tradition could be a source for humility and courage in the political realm. And in response to the pressures of our time, it is all too easy for those of us in the church to either retreat from the public square or to fall prey to our worst instincts, going against Wesley's sage recommendations. We believe that there is another way. And to help us consider it, Dr. Bacote brings expertise and a critical perspective to help us. He is an active teacher, a specialist in the influential work of the 19th century Dutch Reformed theologian Abraham Kuyper, and he's the author of such books as The Political Disciple, A Theology of Public Life, The Spirit in Public Theology, Appropriating the Legacy of Abraham Kuyper, and most recently, Reckoning with Race, and performing the good news in search of a better evangelical theology. He's also widely published in edited volumes, magazines, and journals, where he models an integration of faith and life that is so crucial for navigating the challenges of our rapidly changing world. Most of all, Vince exhibits the humility and the courage that we need so much today, and it's been a joy to get to know him over these past several days. Thank you, Dr. Bacote, for being with us for the Geneva Forum at Upper House tonight, and we look forward to learning from you.
Good evening. It is great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be asked to be the inaugural speaker of the Geneva Forum. I really appreciate the privilege of being able to be here and to speak with you about a very important issue. It's probably no surprise to any of us that or news to any of us, that we are in a interesting divided time in the United States of America. It's not just the United States of America, but definitely the United States of America. And Christians are definitely doing their part, unfortunately, to pick sides. Of course, if you're a Christian, you are a person of faith. You are a person who is a follower of Jesus Christ. And as a follower of Jesus Christ, what does it mean to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ in a time like this, in a time where we have this division? What does that faithfulness look like? It just so happens that I have 3 headings that begin with the letter R. It just worked out that way. You might say, oh, it's that preacher training, isn't it? Maybe. But they all begin with the letter R, a little alliteration in case you want to remember it. I'll tell you what they are as we get to them. The first one is this: remember our public opportunity. Remember our public opportunity. Now, if I'm saying remember our public opportunity, that means that there could be amnesia about that public opportunity, or it could be that it's learning about it. But I think it's important to remember it because it was given to us at some point. In fact, it was given to us at the beginning. Now, before talking about remembering our public opportunity, I want to first note that one of the most important things for pursuing faithful politics in a divided world is that we think about the Christian faith as a living faith. And what I mean by a living faith is a faith that is not just about how we talk about things. Now, I teach theology for a living. How people talk about the faith, that's important. Get the doctrine right. But this is not about an exercise in abstractions. Okay, let's just get it right up here and let's just focus on the conversation. Conversations are important, but life is to be lived. And last time I checked, Jesus said, follow me, not just talk about me. So if we're going to not just talk about him, but follow him, live as his followers, then we have to have a living faith. It needs to be confessed, yes, but it also needs to be concrete in its expression, in its practice. It needs to be a faith that walks around. Now, this faith that walks around, when we're talking about remembering our public opportunity, is one where we need to get to that remembrance by understanding this. The first Great Commission remains for us. The first Great Commission. Now, many of you watching may hear the term Great Commission and you think Matthew 28 or Acts 1:8. Those are good texts to think about. Great Commissions for sure. But there is a first Great Commission on the first page of the Bible. And that is in Genesis 1:26-28. When God creates humans, he gives humans an incredible purpose that comes with an incredible task. He says humans are to be the ones who are to have dominion over the creation. Now, it's God's creation, and God is giving them the responsibility to have dominion over this creation. In other words, it's an exercise of stewardship that God is giving human beings over his world. Humans are responsible to him for what they do in his world. And so he says, humans, you are to have dominion over my creation. Now, notice I said that the first Great Commission remains. Why is it important to say that this first Great Commission remains? Now, this first Great Commission is one, if he says have dominion over my creation, that means everything that goes on with the life of that creation is a human responsibility. That includes how humans order their life together and how they order that life together, particularly beyond the family unit. When we're doing that ordering of life together beyond our family unit, that's when we get into talking about political realities. So it is one of the dimensions that emerges from this first Great Commission. But why say that it is a commission that remains? Because some people might say, hey, it's great you said that, Vince. Did you think about chapter 3? Because in chapter 3, you know, there's a curse. And doesn't it just all kind of just wither away and God says, hey, forget it? Thing is, he didn't say forget it. He said it's complicated, is what he said. Because when the curse is pronounced, he doesn't say there's no more birth. He doesn't say that there's no more fruitfulness with what happens with what you do in creation. No, now there's birth and there's going to be labor. And now, whatever you're doing when you're engaging the world, and specifically talking about agriculture in that moment, you will get fruitfulness, but you're not only going to get fruitfulness. You're going to get weeds, thorns, and thistles. It's going to be kind of complicated. It's going to be kind of hard. You're going to have some labor involved. So the point being that post-Genesis 3, the first commission remains, but boy, is it complicated. God does not say when people leave the garden. He says, get out of here. What I told you, forget it. Run for your life. One day you get a Savior. That's not what he said. The first Great Commission remains. Now, that first Great Commission is very important to say. It remains, and it's not in competition with what people traditionally think about when they say Great Commission. So, Great Commission, go into all the world, make disciples of all nations. You know, the Spirit's going to come upon you. You'll be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. Very important things to do. Now, here's the important thing. Nowhere does that mean, and by the way, please have amnesia about what I said on the first page. None of that is the situation. Rather, as a matter of fact, I think what happens is, or what is possible for us, is that now in this new era, after the resurrection of Jesus and after Pentecost, now you have people who are able to be human beings made alive by God's Spirit, who recognize that this commission is there for them, and that in this commission that they are able to live like human beings ought to live. Because what is a person made alive by the Spirit? This is a person who is becoming, I like to say, rehumanized. And a rehumanized person is a person that ought to be recognizing that when it comes to how I ought to live as a human, I need to think about what God wants humans to do in his world. What does it include? It includes the first Great Commission. So the first Great Commission remains, and there is no dissonance. There is no war between the first and second Great Commissions. I think that's very important because there might be people who think, oh, now you're going to go up here talking about politics and stuff. Does that mean that's all about politics and you're not going to be thinking about people meeting Jesus, etc.? No, actually, it's about people really do need to meet Jesus so they can become more humanized. And as they're more humanized, maybe their politics become more human in the way that they are conducting it. So there's no competition between these commissions. Now, it's also important to note this. it's true that when it comes to the political expression, the political opportunity that there is out of this First Great Commission, it's an opportunity in terms of the agency of persons. It's an opportunity that has had, I would say, different levels of agency across world history and in differing contexts. Okay, so in some places, depending upon what the kind of government you have, how much agency you have. How about this much agency is what some people have. So you'll only be, in terms of your political expression, kind of like a Mennonite, like an alternative witness, what you're doing in your community in that type of setting. But I'm speaking to you today from Madison, Wisconsin, which is in the what? The United States of America, a republic. Interesting thing about that republic, a republic where we say that any citizen can actually be involved in the political system as a representative. Even one day, your kid can be president. At least that's what we say in elementary school. Obviously, we've only had 45 of them, so it can't be most people. But the point is that we say that if you're in the United States of America, you have political agency. And the point is that if you are a Christian in the United States of America, if that is your context and you have that kind of agency, then we are talking about being in a context that when it comes to your stewardship of God's world, when it comes to politics, your agency when we're talking about the First Great Commission, you've got a lot more political opportunity than most people have had in world history. So the opportunity is there in a context like this one to do the work of discernment with God about what your agency might be. Now, please at least vote. Now, some of you might say, well, I don't like this one and I don't like that one. Okay, I understand that. But first of all, do you realize that most people around the world do not have this kind of agency? That's the first thing. The second thing is, when you're voting, you're not voting for the Messiah. And because you're not voting for the Messiah, right, then, pick the least evil one, at least. At least go with that. Because most people do not have that stewardship opportunity. At least do that. At most, perhaps be the person that runs for office. That's not going to be most people. But for some people, maybe they should think about that. In between that, there's thinking about all the different things you can do, like reaching out to your congressman, reaching out to your mayor, showing up at town halls, going to school board meetings. All those types of things are agency that you can have where you can participate in the political process. So you have significant opportunity in a context like the United States. But you might not even be aware of that opportunity if you have amnesia or no recognition of the public opportunity we have because of the First Great Commission. So we need to remember that we have a public opportunity. We have to start there. I mean, no reason to talk about faithful politics if you don't think that there's any activity to be doing, okay? But we do have an opportunity, and we've had it from page 1. It's gotten complicated since chapter 3 in Genesis, but it remains. Nowhere is there a veto of the First Great Commission in the Bible. And because there is not, our public opportunity remains. So remember our public opportunity. That's the first R. The second R is to resist triumphalism and cynicism. To resist triumphalism and cynicism. What is triumphalism? Triumphalism is when a person or group of persons believe, now they may not say this, but this is what it kind of comes down to, they believe that they have a very clear vision of exactly what political realities ought to be like, and they are certain that if those political realities are in place, basically, now, they're not going to say this, but maybe it's really what they think. They think, if we just did this, if we just had this policy, in fact, if everybody like in the universe had this policy, then what we would have? We'd have something that looks just like the kingdom of God, they're very enthusiastic about their political vision. And they are certain that if you put their political vision into practice, then this is going to be great for everyone. Why is that a problem? Well, how about this? Because Paul said he sees through a glass darkly. Now, look, if Paul sees through a glass darkly, okay, I'm going with Paul about his lack of seeing clarity. And if he says that a lack of clarity, I don't think that anybody else somehow has this perfectly sanctified vision that enables them to see so clearly in terms of what they're going to propose politically that they need to say, if everybody just did this, then we would have in place politically something that is the most crystal clear, perfect expression of the kingdom of God politically. So triumphalism is a problem. Now, it's very important to understand this. To be optimistic, to be active in political life does not make you a triumphalist. That's a very important thing to say, because I think some people feel like if you think that Christians ought to have an influence and that Christians have some confidence about what a policy might do, confidence does not necessarily equal triumphalism. It could, if they're really feeling, really drinking their Kool-Aid, let's put it that way, when it comes to their vision. But if you're just saying, I think I have a well-considered approach here, and let's try this, and I think we might get something really good out of this, that's not triumphalism. Triumphalism is when you are sure that if you put these things in place, it's great, nothing ever needs to change, and really all we need to do is just put it in place and keep it in place. That's triumphalism. Now, that's a problem, right? So we need to resist triumphalism. We also need to resist cynicism. What's cynicism? Cynicism is when things don't go well, translation, like a lot of world history, things don't go well, and people say, oh, we never should have gotten involved in all of this political stuff to begin with. And because we got involved in this political stuff, what happens is what? Well, our priorities are out of order. We should just pull back from that. We're too given to temptations, to power, and now we're just all out of whack. And the thing is that why are they cynical? Because when it comes to talking about politics, they really just only have a kind of snarky response to Christian engagement in politics, or a critical response to Christian engagement in politics. They go, you see, this is of course what happens when you get too close to politics. Strangely, I think I saw things on this on Twitter in the last year when people were talking about things after the election. You see what happens when people get so close to power, and they get so close to power, they start changing the way that they do things, they start changing their priorities. This is what happens, you get too close to politics. What I always found interesting about that is I wonder what those same people would have said if public policies were working out. What they would have said about Christian participation in politics then. Because if the Christian participation in politics was leading to good things and good uses of power, would you be cynical then? And by the way, sometimes that happens. But, for sure, as happens in world history, as happens when you have human beings who, even if they are made alive by God's Spirit, regenerated people, even they still have, the undertow of depravity in the way that they go about things. And because they have that undertow of depravity in the way that they go about things, they can get things wrong. And sometimes they can actually advocate for things that are wrong, that are bad. Okay? So those things happen. What do you do when, you're faced with something that is now going to be part of the list of the worst hits of Christian engagement in public life? What do you do with that? Is cynicism your response? I really don't think that that's the most constructive response. I do think lament is a very Christian response. Because the point is not either be cynical or be in denial, right? Cynical because, well, you see what happens. It was really bad. Denial. I didn't see anything, right? It's not either of those. No, call it out. Admit it went wrong. You know, I'll give you an example, by the way. You know, my dissertation figure was a great man, but he also was intoxicated by being a great man at times. And because he was intoxicated by being a great man, not everything he did was good. Not everything that he wrote was good. Not everything he did politically was good. I'm talking about Abraham Kuyper for those who, since I didn't mention his name. And my point is this, is that I need to be able to tell the truth about that and lament that, but not say, and therefore this is why the best thing for us to do is to just withdraw from politics, be cynical about it, and just have a kind of refuge of piety, right? Where we just do quote unquote spiritual things and we leave politics to other people. Two reasons why that's a problem. One, I just mentioned the First Great Commission. It remains for us. That's reason number one. Reason number two, because chances are those people who are going to a refuge of piety, even if let's say that they have like the most privileged, cushy existence, at some point, because those people surrendered the political bus, the driving of the political bus to someone else, they're probably going to start complaining about what happened at some point where somebody took the political bus. So withdrawing from the politics into a refuge of piety isn't really the way to go. No, instead, what do? We lament how things go wrong. We actually are not surprised if we believe that depravity is real. Then don't be surprised that sometimes people show that they are, still on the path of sanctification. And that what remains on that path has now shown up by what they did wrong, by how things got messed up. That's what we ought to be actually aware of, that, yeah, that's going to happen. Because most Christian traditions do not believe that at any point during a Christian's life that they arrive at some completely sanctified reality. If that's the case, then don't expect people to deliver anything messianic politically. In fact, expect them to deliver things that you need to hang a sign on them, that where you say it always is subject to refinement and revision. That is what you need to say about whatever people do when they propose something politically, culturally, etc. Why? Because they're imperfect people with incomplete vision who have an undertow of depravity. That's just the way that it is. Good things can happen out of the fact that they, the sanctified dimensions of their vision, but bad things can happen out of the undertow of the depravity. So we have to be aware of that. And if we're aware of that, I think we can lament how things go wrong because of the undertow of depravity. But we can also celebrate the things that happen because they propose things that were helpful. Not things that brought about the arrival of the kingdom, but they did bring some good into the political realm. So, no triumphalism, no cynicism. Well, then what? This is what I propose. I like to use the phrase transformation without triumphalism. Transformation without triumphalism. So what does that mean? That means, okay, remember the First Great Commission. You still have this opportunity to be participating in God's world. Ever since Genesis 3, things have been going wrong in God's world. But even with things going wrong, humans have, in spite of all the evil, they've put good into the world. After the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus and ascension, and then after Pentecost, you have these people who are made alive by God's Spirit, who are in a rehumanization process. And if they're in a place like the United States, they have political agency. And these people can participate with a kind of vision where they want to consider how to bring what we will call some penultimate good to the issues that they care about. And you do it seeking to make things at least a little bit better. And you seek to do that without the hubris that goes along with triumphalism, and without the cynicism where you think it can just only go wrong. So you can have transformation without triumphalism, I believe. And really the way that we have that is we remember that we have this opportunity, and having this opportunity, we do it, but we're always doing it knowing that we have to, at best, have penultimate contributions in what we do politically. So resist triumphalism and cynicism. Point number one, just for our review, remember our public opportunity. Number two, resist triumphalism and cynicism. The third R, resolve to address race and other complex challenges. Resolve to address race and other complex challenges. Before I get to race, I'm going to talk about a particular complex challenge that lots of people have been talking about recently. Why, what would that be, Vince? Nationalism is what that would be. People are probably thinking, well, I knew he was going to say nationalism because everybody's talking about it. So, yes, we have to talk about nationalism, and it's really important that we clarify that there is a distinction between what you call patriotism and what you call nationalism. Patriotism is proper care, proper regard for your country, seeking the good of your country. No problem with that. I mean, you ought to care about where you are. You ought to seek the good for that. I mean, God told the Israelites when they're in Babylon, seek the good. Pray for the good of the city where you are. Seek that good. This is what patriots do. That's fine. Well, what's nationalism? Nationalism is when everything serves the interests of your nation. In other words, it's idolatry. Nationalism is when you worship the country. Nationalism is when God is actually the sponsor of the country. You know, I've said this in other places, and I think this is a good place to say it, like what I said elsewhere, and that is this. Nationalism is when you take your flag and you drape it over the cross. And you drape it over the cross. Why? Because the cross is supposed to be sponsoring your nation. Now, please understand, by the way, nations come and go. Nations have expiration dates. Nations have a shelf life. Jesus is raised to live evermore. Jesus is the king. He has no interest in being anybody's sponsor. He is king. He is Lord. And he would say something like, you know, don't put your cross, your flag over my cross. It's not going to stay there. Now, if you want to put your flag at the foot of my cross, then we can talk about it. A patriot is willing to put their flag at the foot of the cross. A nationalist is saying, can't I just kind of cover up the cross and drape it like in my colors? God's not interested in being the sponsor of anybody's colors. He's not the sponsor. To be Lord is not to be sponsor. To be Lord is to be the ruler, the one who is over all. And what that means is, however you're thinking about your participation in a country, it needs to be a participation where, because Jesus is number one, you're actually even willing to criticize your country. You're actually willing to say that if I have to choose between being a patriot to my nation and being a disciple of Jesus Christ, guess who wins? Jesus wins. Not my nation. Okay? Nations come and nations go. And please understand, I'm very happy to be a citizen of the United States of America. But I'm also aware of the fact that the Bible says nothing about the United States of America. You would think sometimes with the way some Christians think about the United States of America that, oh, and of course, once upon a time, God said, and what will be the centerpiece of salvation history? Well, a long time in the future, there's going to be this nation called the United States of America. How about that's wrong? How about that's rather inventive? Because there are no Western Hemisphere countries mentioned in the Bible. And if there are no Western Hemisphere countries mentioned in the Bible, why would anybody in this country get it in their head that somehow this is like the centerpiece of what God is doing in history? Where do you see that in the Bible? Okay, how about nowhere is where you see it? And so the point is not that you shouldn't be a patriot, but the point is that Jesus is Lord, and most of what the Bible talks about is rather Middle Eastern. Right? Western Hemisphere, closest you get is go into all the earth, make disciples of all nations. That's the closest you get. United States of America, not mentioned. Not mentioned. And so, if you're in this country that is, a lot of people outside the United States think, wow, what a religious country. Whatever we think about, the challenges of religiosity in the United States, outside the United States, people think they're just so religious in the United States. In this country, we need to recognize that, yes, there are things that are unique about it, but uniqueness doesn't make you the center of salvation history. It does mean, well, there's something going on here, and maybe there are opportunities here because of the place we've given to religiosity, because of we're a country where, you can be a Catholic and you can be a Protestant and you don't kill each other. That maybe there's something unique about that, about people being able to live well together across, or at least tolerate each other religiously. That's a very interesting thing, right? But none of that means a centrality in God's plan to this country. So we have to be careful to be patriots who are disciples first, but always, citizens of our particular domains second. Because, when Jesus returns, he's not going to be asking about your flag. Right? When he returns, he's going to be asking about your fidelity to him. That's what it comes down to, not what colors. So, nationalism has been a problem. And it's not a new problem, but I think we've gotten to a particular point where, for some Christians, because they've thought about the religiosity of the United States of America, and particularly the Christian religiosity of the United States of America, and the way they've seen that threatened, and the way they've associated the fortunes of the United States with Christianity, you've gotten this blend of patriotism and religiosity that becomes a kind of Christian nationalism. The problem with that is that even if you take the religiosity seriously, it's been a really complicated religiosity. Right? And it's been a complicated religiosity because of the second thing I'm going to talk about, because of race. Here's something to think about before I get into addressing race specifically. Is anyone here on the camera or in the camera or here in this room aware of any time in the history of the United States where we've had a revival around the question of race? Have we ever had that? We have not. We have not had a revival around the question of race. But we've had a lot of problems around the question of race. And we've had a lot of problems where Christians have been instrumental in antagonizing those problems. That's part of our history. That's one of the reasons why I think whatever we say about, I'm worried about what's going to happen to our country because these certain changes are happening, God is going to judge us. Anyone who says that must have amnesia about what happens when you are involved with human trafficking of people who are black and you oppress them by law for most of the history of your country. The fact that the country is still here is an amazing thing if you're worried about God bringing judgment. Because there's plenty that's already happened for God to bring judgment just around the horror of the history of race. And so I think, however we're thinking about, what God's going to do with our country, we got to say, thank God for his mercy that he didn't destroy this country because of what we did around race. That's what we ought to say, rather than thinking, oh, because of what's happening with sexuality and other things, now God's going to do something. Now God's going to do something? So I think we have to have that kind of perspective. Now, when it comes to race, some have potential reason, I would say, to think that we are in a potential trajectory of having a kind of new day around the question of race post-George Floyd, because there were lots of marches, and of course, there are people in these marches, including people like, say, Mitt Romney. I don't know if any of you saw Mitt Romney marching, but I saw Mitt Romney marching. And yes, I mean, I had to blink a few times to make sure that I was seeing Mitt Romney marching about, it's somewhere in D.C. and talking, using the phrase Black Lives Matter, etc. I thought, what is happening? Now, a person might think, because of what we'll call Mitt Romney types of moments, that, now something is happening. And the something, I think, that what happened was, in our social media world, where lots of things get shared, when the George Floyd video was shared and people saw for nearly 10 minutes George Floyd being choked out under the knee of Derek Chauvin, there are probably a lot of people who'd heard things about police brutality in African Americans, but always thought, well, it can't really be true, because nobody saw Trayvon Martin get shot. Nobody saw Michael Brown get shot. Nobody knows what happened with Sandra Bland. I mean, we just keep calling all the different names, right? So nobody saw these things, and here you have basically what in cinema they call a long take, where the camera is just on the action, and it's not moving in that action, and you're just there looking at it. And for people who looked at that long enough, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And for many people, it was a kind of awakening to that, oh, you mean it's true? Yes, it's true. It's been true a long time. And I think for what some then think, because we had a lot of marches, a lot of protests, and most of the protests, by the way, for in case people are thinking, well, what about the riots, etc., maybe 5% of the protests were that way. So it was not mostly about violence. Most of these protests were encouraging a form of action, and they were multi-ethnic. There were a lot of white people involved, right? A lot of Asians, of course, a lot of African Americans and Latinos. And I think that's given some people a certain kind of optimism. Here's my sense about that. What I say is, we have to wait and see, 5 years, 10 years to wait and see. And the reason we had to wait 5 years or 10 years to wait and see is because anybody can get excited about a moment and go to marches and do that for a season. The question is, what's happening in families? The question is, what's happening in churches? The question is, what's happening in public policy? The question is, what's happening in public health? What's happening in public education? What's happening with economic opportunity? Those are the things where we need to see things change, so that you're beginning to see real changes in the level of life chances for people that are non-white, and particularly people that are African American and Latino. Because there are a series of factors that together are the things that antagonize the flourishing of a disproportionate number of people who are non-white and that are particularly Black and Latino. And so we have to wait and see. I'm not saying no, but we have to wait and see on that. Now, what's also part of the challenge, though, is that I think no matter what the particular discourse is that people are having around the question of race, I think when it starts to be discussed, there's this thing that happens to people's bodies, right? And where people, they aren't sure where this is going to go, and they're not sure whether, okay, is this going to be a blow up? Are people going to start yelling? Is somebody going to start screaming? Well, somebody might in some cases, actually. So let's not kid ourselves, right? Because some people, they've been like a pressure cooker for a long time, right? And then they're going to blow up. So that might happen with some people. But with a lot of other people, they're just not sure what's going to happen if they really get into this. And so what I want to say is this. Look, if we're going to have a faithful politics, a faithful, Christians faithfully honoring God, stewarding this world in the first Great Commission, then you've got to be seeking the good of the entire world. And if you're seeking the good of the entire world, and you're doing it in your local world, the United States, you've got to be addressing the question of race. Because for most of the history, the country, by law, discriminated against people, particularly people who were black. And no matter what year you want to start, if you want to start at 1619, hey, let's not start at 1619. Let's start at 1776. How about that? Okay? If you just go from 1776 to 1964 and 65, that's still a long time. And then we have just over a half a century since, by law, African Americans have had rights in this country. And so that's kind of like hardwiring into the country antagonism towards people that are non-white, particularly people who are African American and Latino, and definitely Native Americans. Can't forget that, right? That's one of our first Holocausts over here. So if that's been part of what we've done, and we haven't had a revival, and also that we haven't had revival by legislation because laws have been passed, then work needs to be done to deal with what the effects of all the horror that was hardwired into the country. We have to do that work. And here's the thing, by the way. Of all people, Christians ought to be the ones that, one, aren't surprised that, yes, once again, humans did things that were horrific because you believe human beings are sinners. So why are you surprised that human beings act like sinners, and sometimes greatly like sinners, from what they do as individuals to the way they can create systems that antagonize people? None of that should surprise anybody. It's in the Bible, right? Israel did it. So if that's part of what's happened, then if we know that, but we also know that the people of God are people who are made alive and people who have, in different times and places in world history, done heroic things, socially, politically, culturally. There are people who are always happy to talk about how, we wouldn't have so many of the good things that we have in civilization if it weren't for Christians. How about if we add to that what we did about race? What if that was the case? If the people who were known for leading the way on the question of race were the people who had the courage to look and to say, okay, to really deal with this, I am actually going to be going into a horror movie. Because you are going to a horror movie if you really want to know what the deal is. And it's a horror movie where, here's the thing, you always have the option to escape if you're not a minority. You can just check out at any time. And the point is that you decide you're not checking out. You're staying checked in with it, because you've got to stay checked in with this to really know what the horror was. I think sometimes the problem is people think, oh, well, bad things happened and it was really too bad. It's like, well, how bad do you think it was? How many people, really know what happened with the Tulsa race riots? That's just one example, right? How many people really know about what happened with all the ways that when Reconstruction was happening, there was, a sort of snapback, with Jim Crow, and with lots of ways that people decided to, if you will, police African Americans, include by doing things like lynching. And that these are public things, and sometimes things that were done after church. My point is that when you enter into that horror, it's going to be a shock because it's real horror, okay? It's not cinema. It's real human lives. The inhumanity of humans to other humans. You have to really enter into that and then say, all right, I'm in the United States of America. I'm in a country that talks about rights. I'm in a country that talks about opportunity. And I'm also in a country that actively antagonizes the possibilities of certain people to have those opportunities. And that even with laws being passed, those laws don't erase the momentum of everything that was in place before then. I mean, I wish there was revival by legislation in ways that it just undid everything that happened before, but that's not what happens. I mean, let's just use one of the classic examples. How do you undo when the federal government is the ones that said, if minorities move next door, your property values are going to go down. And that when you build new neighborhoods, okay, those neighborhoods should be for whites only. And that, in other words, what you do is you antagonize what is central to wealth creation for Americans, and you do what? You make it possible, especially post-World War II, for people that are white to begin to get their on-ramp for building wealth, but you antagonize the possibilities for African Americans to do it. Now, someone might say, well, Kenneth Chenault, was the CEO of American Express. Well, why can you tell me about Kenneth Chenault? Because he's an exception. Point being that who is going to be the ones who says, I'm going to look at the horror. It's a complicated horror. There's lots of different things that are going to happen. And I'm going to begin to say, at least let me be sure about what's here. And then I'm going to be thinking about the fact that if there was this first Great Commission, and I'm not going to be cynical about the fact that things have gone wrong, and I'm not going to be a naive triumphalist about that, how am I going to begin to try to imagine ways to use part of my political stewardship to address the ongoing problems of race? Am I going to be willing to do that? And here's what's important with being willing to do this. To be willing to do this is being willing to be involved in something that is going to take a long time, and something that's massively complicated, and something where if you deal with it, yes, you're probably going to have some moments where people are really, really upset, and where people don't understand each other, and where people are mad at each other perhaps for a long time. That's kind of the way it goes. But that you're saying, yes, that's kind of par for the course, because we're dealing with the effects of horror, and we're dealing with the effects of trauma, and we're dealing with the effects of antagonizing a people. But you say you're going to get in that game and stay in that game, knowing that this is not like a sitcom where it's done in 22 minutes in commercials, but that you were talking decades. That's what I'm talking about. And I think it's important to say that I understand why someone might say, I don't want to do this. Because to face what is there is to face something that will shock you. Right? And the thing is that I mentioned to someone earlier today, I said, people are happy to talk about, the Holocaust, etc. Somebody said, yeah, well, the Holocaust was somewhere else. Looking in your own backyard can be a harder thing to do. But if you're willing to look in the backyard and say, yes, this is horror. And if you're also willing to look in your toolbox and discover that for many people, perhaps part of the reason that they also get nervous is because there's nothing in their toolbox when it comes to addressing race. But you're saying, okay, there's nothing in the toolbox. All right. So maybe I need to acquire tools and do the work of acquiring tools. That's okay. That's okay. You don't have to show up already ready. Just show up ready to learn, ready to participate, ready to do a lot of listening, a lot of discovery. That's what needs to happen. And I think that there needs to be kind of two things that may seem opposite to each other that have to be in place. You have to have tremendous patience and tremendous impatience at the same time. You have to have tremendous patience because barring the revival around race. And please understand, I mean, we've had revivals in world history, a number of times. We could have one, but of course, why do we report on them? Because they're exceptional. So maybe that's not going to happen. So if that's not going to happen, you've got to have the patience, the fact it's going to take a while. But you have to have an impatience that keeps you at it, because you know that when we talk about race, we are in the modern West, we are talking about, in terms of world history, one of the greatest ways that people have shown antagonism to the second grace commandment. They've put an asterisk by neighbor when it's come to certain people. And they've said, because there's that asterisk, then we can dehumanize them. And that you're impatient about the fact that that has happened. And you're patient about the fact that that remains. And that impatience keeps you in the game, even if it seems like you're spinning your wheels. This is important. And I think it's an important example of what we need to do if we're going to talk about faithful politics in a divided world, because faithful politics in a divided world isn't just hope for a revival and then it happens and then we're all singing Kumbaya. Faithful politics in a divided world is faithfulness to God in his world. Remembering that first Great Commission, not being a triumphalist, not being cynical, right? And resolving to address these challenges by being in it for a long time, no matter what the results look like. Because our participation isn't because we're certain that we're going to make a realized eschatology happen around race in the next 5 years, or the next 10 years, or the next 20 years. You know what a realized eschatology is? That means the fullness of the kingdom of God arrives in something that you do. The eschaton, the end of all things, when God's reign is undisputed and there is shalom, that it is realized. That's not why you stay. You stay because we are people of hope, not people of certainty that our plans are going to work out. And because God has never taken away from us the commission he gave us from the start. And so that if we participate in that commission, we have the opportunity to be people, sometimes feeling like we're making it up as we go along, to be the people who are just staying at it, dealing with the twists and turns, dealing with the disappointments, being thankful for the victories, but we stay at it even if it seems like things are still or things are going backwards. And if that is what we are characterized by, we're characterized by that consistent participation, then I think the reputation of Bible-believing Christians is going to change. Because they're doing something that most people aren't doing. It's easier to just pick your side in the echo chamber, pick your side in ideological polarization, and then just, think, I see the world clearly, everybody else is an idiot. It's a different thing to say, I'm participating in the first Great Commission. I'm not going to be cynical. I'm not going to be a triumphalist. I'm resolving to participate. And I'm participating because I'm seeking the good of everybody. Not just those who agree with me, not just those who look like me, not just those who believe like me, but everyone who is a divine image bearer. And that is what I must do. I hope that can be our reputation. Thanks.
Thank you, Vincent, for your words. We're moving now to a time of Q&A. And we've had a number of questions already, so I'll just get us started here. Peter asks, how does the concept of be in the world but not of it, from John 15, inform an orientation toward politics that sets Christians apart?
Sure. I think the first thing is that when we say be in the world and not of it, in that sense, it means we are actually willing to participate in the created order in political life. And we're remembering that we're Christians. In other words, we don't have amnesia about the fact that we have those fundamental commitments to God and his kingdom. And that those commitments are, if you will, the thing that are giving us our compass, our direction for how we go about participating in our politics. It also means that it gives us a perspective where we don't expect, politics to be everything. We don't expect politics to be what brings the realization of the kingdom of God. But it is one of the ways that we can participate in God's world, and politics is one of the ways that we can seek the good of others, and in seeking that good of others, it's a way to love our neighbors.
Thanks. That was a warm-up. So here's one that maybe will be stump you a little more. Ellen asks, can you suggest a theology for engagement on social media, especially around contentious social and political issues?
That's a very good question. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is the theology of any kind of engagement with other human beings needs to be a theology where we're asking about the fact that how do I engage others, whether I see them or not? Because I think what happens on social media is that we actually flatten out what human beings are. If you're on Twitter, you think somebody's reducible to 140 characters, and you think you know everything about them. It's like you don't know anything about them, actually, unless it's somebody you actually know in person. You only know how they present themselves there. So I think in terms of contentious social engagement, one, I think we have the discernment of whether or not to engage. Because social media in general is not the best place to do that engagement. If someone is doing that, then I think they have a commitment to always taking the high ground and make sure that even if somebody is someone where perhaps you're tempted to say, Lord, please bring retribution to that person, that you then actually want to be inclined to seek the good of that person rather than for lightning to strike that person. But I think that has to be clear, because just as I said, I talked about race as one of the things where you have an asterisk beside neighbor. Social media is a great place to put asterisks by neighbors when it's not the person that you like, or that representation of them on social media is something you don't like. So you want to say they get the anti-neighbor treatment. Problem is that Jesus didn't say there are any exceptions to neighbor. Even the person that makes you want to scream is your neighbor. And so it is incumbent upon us in those situations then to put into those situations things that are expressions of neighbor love. Sometimes that means saying nothing. Sometimes it means communicating with people outside of a thread, probably. And it certainly, I think, it means having a commitment to pray for them. Because, again, we don't know why somebody is brought to whatever it is that they're doing on social media. We only know how they present themselves to us. So we have to be mindful of how little we actually know about those persons. What we do know is that they're divine image bearers, and they're human beings, and that we are to love them as ourselves. And so I think that's a start of a theology of engagement in terms of social media.
Your mention of Twitter being, I think it's 280 characters now, but that's beside the point. Do you have any distinctions you make between the different platforms? Like, is there a better platform to engage or a worse one? Just to follow up, I'm wondering.
That's a great question, Dan. I don't know is the answer. I do know that the one that makes me more depressed is Twitter. But I stay on social media because there's a lot, there's articles I've discovered I wouldn't otherwise discover. Sometimes there are things that are hilarious, like these people on Twitter talking about whether you put sugar or butter on grits and stuff. And people are very, very intense about those things. Those are hilarious. Unfortunately, Twitter isn't just those at lighter fare. There are other things where, it really is like I need to pray, and I need to just put it away, because it's only just like an undertow, just drags you down. So I think Twitter, perhaps because of the brevity of it, I think it just makes it harder. So I think Instagram and Facebook are a little bit less that way, but even there you have the problems.
All right. David and Kiri both ask, how would you advise church leaders, and especially pastors, on directly speaking to political issues or calling for political action from the pulpit, as opposed to speaking just generally about issues?
What I would recommend is, one, I would ask people, what's your tradition? Because to the extent that let's say that at least 50% of the people in your church know your tradition, then what is it from your tradition that orients people towards a certain kind of public responsibility, right? And how do I move from that public responsibility to then saying, here's why we need to talk about these issues? Earlier today I was saying to someone, when it comes to the history of the black church, for example, just survival was the reason for doing things. So it's not starting with the theology and then you're doing it. It's like, no, I have, we need to keep people alive. We need to figure out education. We need to figure out public health, et cetera. So you had the preacher as this leader. Now, to be fair, there are definitely traditions as within the African American church, just as within every denomination, where there's some people who are like, we need to just get folks saved. And that's what church is for. But you have, I'd say, a greater proportion of people talking about political things from the pulpit, historically, I think, with African American churches. Churches that aren't like that, again, I think it really depends upon how does your tradition and the way your people understand your tradition create an on-ramp for you to do that. I think that's the best way to do that, because then you're talking out of the tradition. It doesn't seem like you just picked a topic and you wanted to use the pulpit to, you're using your power. And I think also that does include making it clear how that tradition understands the relationship between the church and public action. Are there things that the church does as a group, or are there things that you want to encourage your people as congregants to do after the benediction, and they do that as Christians, as citizens, out in the world? So I think those things have to be clearly articulated, and I think if people understand that, then it's easier to speak about politics.
Thank you. Nick writes in the chat, and this is particularly relevant for a place like Madison. How can we best engage our political agency in an increasingly post-Christian culture and political climate such as Madison? So maybe the question's recognizing sort of that there are particular places that we might call post-Christian, that's a term we'd have to define, I guess, but that practicing politics might be different there than in other parts of the country. Is there a distinction
Sure.
you'd make there?
I guess what I would say is, I think you have to be aware of how to address wherever you are, right? And then I think you have to discern what kinds of conversations can I have, or how do I talk Christianly in this context, even if the people who are, say, post-Christian, they don't know that I'm talking Christianly, but I am. In other words, I don't necessarily use certain vocabulary that people associate with being Christian vocabulary, but I am talking in Christian discourse. I think one of the most important things is when you talk about engaging politics in a post-Christian society, do the post-Christian types know that you actually care about their good and not just your own good? Because I think what a lot of people perceive when they think about Christians in politics is that they are out to get their rights and to do things their way. Whereas I wonder, what if people thought, wait a minute, you actually care about the lives of people that don't believe anything that you believe. You care about their families. You care about good coming to them. You don't want to just get the power and then marginalize them. I don't think that that's generally what people perceive. Now, some people, they're going to just be hostile. But that's not surprising if we read the Bible. That, of course, there are people who are going to be hostile. So that shouldn't surprise us. Again, I would say there's the unique opportunity of even participating in certain ways in the United States. So how do I learn to do that when some contexts may be a little bit more hostile or a lot more hostile? But how do I become characterized by seeking the common good, not just my particular good? I think that's a way to be known for talking about things or pursuing things where you might even work with people that are surprised that you would want to work with them, but you find common cause.
It reminds me of something we were talking about earlier today about theologians like you, and part of your work is to do the work of translation um, of biblical concepts of theology into a more public language, or a language that can be talked about in the public square, regardless of any type of particular religious background. And I think that type of translation might change depending on where you're doing the translating and who you're trying to translate to.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And some of that means you've got to also just be willing to say sometimes you need to throw it at a wall and see if it sticks. It's okay to experiment. It's okay to use your imagination. It's okay to just try it. It's all right. God can handle it.
All right. David asks, what are your thoughts? This is another fastball, hardball. What are your thoughts on the militaristic language of the Bible that some in our culture use to justify extreme positions? And what alternate vocabulary would you use, if not militaristic language, to convey a more authentic gospel?
What militaristic language are they talking about?
They don't cite it. That's a good question.
I mean, because I know that there are people who might use, fighting for the Lord or something like that. What I would say is, again, if we're talking about politics, and if you're talking about seeking particular aspirations, it does not need to be conveyed militaristically. And I think that sometimes people may use metaphors from, or metaphorically compare something that happened in an Old Testament circumstance to a certain cause. I mean, to me, I think that is not exactly the most careful use of the Bible. So I want to encourage people to have their politics really be versions of thinking about how you're seeking the good. And sometimes you're seeking the good may require greater effort, might require certain kinds of advocacy where you've got to really make your case very strongly. And you know that there are people who are treating you as an enemy, and you have to be aware of that. But that's not a reason, I think, to think about whatever we're doing politically as somehow like we're fighting like the Lord's war or whatever. I mean, God doesn't need us to fight for him. Right? So, I mean, he does want us to be faithful to him. But we don't need to use militaristic language. I know that there are some people that do that. I think it's important to say that I think depending on the traditions people come from, there are different ways that people get to that, I think. And obviously, at least from my vantage point, do you want to be known for your fidelity to God above all, which means that whatever you pursue is because your loyalty is to God, not to other things. But second, that you are militant if you're militant about anything, you're militant about love of neighbor. And that's every person. And seeking the good of every person. And that's the thing you're going to be militant about. And there may be disagreements about what that good is, but you are definitely committed to seeking that. And that is the basis for what you are pursuing politically.
Thanks. Elizabeth asks, how can we encourage a loving but purposeful move away from Christian nationalism? So you talked about that in a big part of your talk. Do you have any thoughts on that, on how to love others? But
well, one, that's also going to require patience. I think part of it is spending time with people and really finding out what are the things that they're afraid of. Because I think fear is a lot of part, is I think a big centerpiece of some people for Christian nationalism. Find out how people are understanding the way that they think that God cares about their lives. And does God care about their lives only if they have political favor in this country? Then also, one of the ways is see if people are willing to learn from traditions where you had to do things with your back up against the wall. Like are you willing to learn from traditions like the Black Church, where you knew you didn't have advantage? So are you willing to see if there's anything from that history that can be helpful. And the point is that in having conversations about that with people, the big thing you're getting at is what is it that's leading you to have this commitment? But again, that takes time. If somebody's talking about family members, then I think you need to have sort of a long game, a prayerful long game about talking to people about their ultimate commitments, and how their commitments are not first about serving the ends of the nation, but serving a God who doesn't even talk about our nation. And the thing is, I mean, you have to like wait a while before you get to saying things like, the Bible actually doesn't say anything about our country, right? And the thing is, you have to say that in a way where you're like, it talks about nations, etc. Doesn't say anything about us specifically. So you have to do that in a really gentle way, and say, but God doesn't have to say anything about us to care about us in terms of our political lives. He cares about us because we're made in His image. He cares about us because we're part of His creation. And I think another thing, actually, that can be helpful for an antidote to Christian nationalism is how much do we actually care about what God wants to do with Christians in places other than the United States? And how much are we willing to have conversations about that? 'Cause I think sometimes what happens is Christians in the United States think that, well, how do I think about Christians in other nations? Oh, I know. They need to pray for the ends of the United States because this will be good for everybody. And of course, if you've been to other countries, that sometimes you discover that people aren't particularly interested in doing things like the United States. They're pretty happy to be like what they are in their country, and they don't need to be what we are in the United States. And that includes Christians in other countries. So we do have to ask, how are we actually thinking about our brothers and sisters who are not here? And what do we want for them? All right, I mean, is what we want for them is just the ends of the United States and how that reverberates everywhere else? That's probably disregarding the particular experiences of them, right? But how do we see the good of them? I think that can be another factor. I think.
Yeah.
But it's going to be hard regardless.
So Andrew asks, how do we become publicly characterized by seeking the common good? Can we hear more about that idea of that public characterization?
Right.
Yeah.
It will have to be concrete actions done by Christians. So what if you have, let's say you have a group of prominent white evangelical leaders in their congregations, and they are the ones who are finding ways to pursue economic vitality in depressed minority neighborhoods, and that they are the ones who are leading those things, and that also they are not putting their bodies there and their money there, and that this is a long-term project, and it's a project where they're also recognizing that part of that participation includes a lot of learning, not just a lot of showing up with the Messiah complex. I think something like that would begin to alter the perception of what evangelical Christians are, because I don't think that's what people think that evangelicals are for. So what if evangelicals, rather than complaining about public school systems, I understand reasons why for various reasons, this agenda, et cetera. It's like, well, I understand that you care about that agenda. I'd also like to know how much you've put into the public schools in terms of your own participation, in terms of your own ideas, in terms of trying to, bring good to the public school system. So what about trying? I mean, and of course, addressing public education is a hugely difficult thing that nobody can seem to figure out. But what if, again, something like that, where there was clear action, right? And of course, there's all different ways that can work out, but clear action to perhaps say, all right, we need to find out ways to creatively address school funding formulas, because part of the problem with public education, of course, is that in at least in a lot of places, school funding formulas are related to real estate values, which means if you live in the right places, you have great schools, smaller classes. You live in other places, fewer teachers, more students, lots of different problems. So the point is, I'm basically saying, if there was an active presence in the face of various forms of public distress that people have, and not just around race. I mean, what if evangelicals are the ones showing up in Appalachia? Same thing. So I think there has to be not just showing up there to evangelize people, but being there to, again, have a long-term commitment to seeking the good and trying to say, how do we bring good here? How do we help good emerge here? And again, not just by being messiahs, by including the agency of the people who are there, but certainly by showing up in those things. Because that's not what, I don't think that's just not the public reputation. The public reputation is advocating for certain particular moral issues, being kind of fearful about people that aren't you, and at least to some people recently, having a sliding scale when it comes to character. When it depends on who's in office. That's the reputation. So there's a lot to be regained. But again, I think if there were concrete actions in time, that would change. That would change the reputation, I believe.
Evan asks, how can we reclaim or recall the positive roles Christians and churches also played in abolition, education, charity, and even civil rights?
Sure.
Would this help reduce cynicism or withdrawal among Christians? So this is almost about the way we tell our own story, I guess, and who do we elevate?
Well, part of it, we had to be willing to just look at the narrative. So which means that we have to do our part within our context of overcoming the obsession with the present that is just typical of our society, right? We're a very immediacy focused society, and that's no different outside the church, I think, right? So there has to be a willingness to say, well, do I even want to know our story? And understand those things, because I think that could be one of the things that helps. But you have to be able to say that even while we were doing this, there were some tremendous failures, and we own those failures. But now we also want to do better than those failures, and we want to encourage the long participation in bringing good to counteract those failures.
Thanks. We'll do two more questions. The one that I almost started reading before by Rachel. How do you weigh the character of a politician and the platform of a politician? How should Christians be thinking about that?
Well, first, to reiterate what I said in my talk, one, remember, I'm not voting for Jesus. So let's start with that. Then, am I actually willing to look at what's on their website, what they're for? Do I really know what policies they care about? I need to see what they actually are talking about doing in the actual grinded out work of politics, because most of politics is not posing for pictures and giving speeches and waving and smiling or speaking to reporters. No, most of it is like being in the work of like making public policy, because this is not like the most like scintillating thing, right? I'm sorry. For anyone who is like public policy is your thing, right? Awesome. So I just want to point that out. It's for many people, that work is not what they think about. But the point is that if you really want to understand what a politician is about, you need to see what that is. And then, of course, I mean, you want to listen to how they're presenting themselves. And if you hear other people talking about them, or if they've had a reputation, investigate that reputation. I mean, does character matter? It does. I think The question is, if you have people that are both of not so great character, then you want to see who's the person that is going to have the least negative effects of their character. But big picture, we should hope that there are people who actually want to be public servants and that they're really seeking the common good. Is that what they're doing? Or are they a politician who's basically serving particular interests, and even if they say things that suggest that they're for everybody, they're really for a certain interest. So I think you try to smoke that out for sure.
All right, we'll try to end on a slightly high note here. Eric asks, how do we keep faith in God's goodness when it seems our society or the world is careening out of control? So that sounds actually like a negative question, but the core of it is, how do we keep faith? How do we keep hope in this time?
We remember Easter and Pentecost. Because, it got pretty bad on Good Friday. It's like, you mean I gave 3 years to this guy? And now he's executed like a common criminal? And he got beat within an inch of his life, and now he's like up on this cross? That's supposed to be this Messiah I'm hanging out with? Good grief. It's all lost. Now, never mind, he'd been telling you he was going to come back, but they didn't. They're like, what's he talking about? Then, surprise or not, I told you guys I was coming back. And he did. And the point is that the hinge of history is the resurrection of Jesus. And ever since then, basically, it's like you've got an hourglass. You turn it upside down, and all the evil is on borrowed time. Don't be surprised that while there's any grain of sand in the hourglass for evil, it will sometimes scream out loud, and you'll think there is no good to be found anywhere. But the fact is that all the while, in spite of the terrible things that happen in the world, good things happen. And in spite of the things that Christians have failed to do, Christians have brought a lot of good in the world. And so we have to be mindful of that. Sometimes when people talk about what they call the now and the not yet, right? That there's like the present reality of the kingdom and the future reality of the kingdom. Some days it's like not yet is on, to use Spinal Tap reference, 11. Okay? Like 11, like on a amplifier instead of 10. Right? So Spinal Tap, all our amplifiers are on 11. Why? Because they wanted to be completely loud. Well, evil will seem that way sometimes. But other times, you're like, wait, some good things happen. Christians showed up and did stuff. Christians made things happen. This has happened a lot in the history of the world. So it's not going to be, until Jesus returns, either all good or either all bad. And sometimes, like when I was driving up here, I heard 60 Minutes talking about Syria and what Bashar al-Assad has done to his own people in Syria. Right? I mean, it's horrible. And you see those things, you think, good grief. But that's not the only thing that happens in the world. Right? So yes, horror, but not only horror.
Thank you, Vincent. Thanks for the Q&A time. So thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to share this video, it'll be on Upper House's YouTube channel very soon and viewable from there. I want to finally thank Geneva Campus Church again for partnering for this first Geneva Forum lecture. If you've registered for this event, you'll be getting an evaluation in an email, and we really appreciate getting your feedback on this event, on both the technical aspects and on Vincent's talk and the Q&A as well. And so with that, have a good evening and go in peace.